I, like a lot of other atheists, believe that the burden of proof rests mostly on the theists. But I think a lot of atheists do a really bad job of describing this, making their case for it, and it leads to a lot of theist confusion. I think the burden of proof rests mostly on the theists, because most atheists that I know are not atheists because of positive arguments against the existence of God. That's why you don't see a lot of these positive arguments against the existence of God, because it acts more of a reinforcer or footnote rather than the actual reason itself. It's also why a lot of atheists will tell you that they're not sure there's no God, they just think that way. And I think it's one of the major reasons why atheists try to avoid the believe there's no God label. Because there's a lot of theistic misunderstandings about it, because it's not really the same sort of belief. While the term is technically correct, there is a difference between sort of atheistic belief that there is no God and theistic belief that there is. But obviously there are atheists who believe that there is no God and think that, you can use positive arguments to deduct that. And, I think they're called colloquially the positive atheists around the YouTube community. But those people, I do believe, have a burden of proof to present positive arguments against the existence of God. But I'm not one of those atheists. And I don't think a lot of atheists really are. Most atheists want to engage in asymmetrical persuasion dialogue. That's where one person is the believer trying to convince the person who's skeptical of that claim. In asymmetrical persuasion dialogue, the burden of proof is on the one making that claim, believing that positive claim, and has to make a convincing argument for that. The skeptic just has to show that those arguments don't hold or don't justify belief. What this means, and this is where a lot of theists get confused, is that if the theist wins, then that justifies reason for God existing. If the skeptic wins, that just means we're at a neutral point. And this is the objection that a lot of theists have. And it's a perfectly valid one. A neutral situation doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. So how can atheism be a justified belief? It's an understandable objection for a lot of theists. I mean, putting yourself in their position, believing in God, and then imagining yourself in the hypothetical situation of neutrality, you're more likely to sway towards God existing. You may be able to push yourself to being completely neutral. You're not going to sway towards God not existing. So why does everyone else seem to be doing that? Unfortunately, that's not how most people react. And that's not what I would say is the most reasonable response. Now, a lot of atheists try to get their point over to the theists to see how they approach this neutrality by making comparisons to things such as God and the Easter Bunny. But then a lot of theists get offended by this, and then they kind of miss the point because they fail to see the comparison between God, which is a legitimate debate, and something such as the Easter Bunny, which we know from its origin was made up. And I used to think that the people who were making this comparison between God and the Easter Bunny were being very sort of simple-minded, but there is a very valid point to this entire thing. So theists, go with me for a second, try to see where I'm coming from, and try not to get offended when I present you with the example of a Cronkaduke. And the aim of this is to get you away from any emotional attachment and predispositional biases that you might have towards God. Suppose after every point I make to try and convince you that the Cronkaduke exists, I have not come up with one convincing argument. What would you do? Chances are that you won't believe me, right? I mean, perhaps you'll even go as far as to say that I'm wrong and that you believe Cronkadukes don't exist. Why is that? I mean, no one's made a positive argument against Cronkadukes. On the face of things, you might be saying, well, there's no arguments against, and I haven't seen a convincing argument for, so it's only rational to be agnostic about Cronkadukes. But in reality, you're probably not going to be, are you? It's because you've looked at the epistemology that they've used. Every idea we have comes from somewhere. If that source is wrong, the idea is probably going to be wrong too. If the reasons we have for believing something are wrong, then we're back at the neutral state. From here, we can go a few ways. We can say that it exists and we just haven't found the valid justification yet, in which case being right about it existing really doesn't seem anything more than blind chance. We can say that Cronkadukes exist but knowing it is beyond our epistemology, in which case you're basically admitting to just having faith that it exists. We could take the agnostic position, which a lot of theists say is rational in this position, and say that, well, it could exist, it could not, we don't know. That is by far the most balanced view. On the face of it, it seems like the most rational view. But is it? I and a lot of other atheists would argue that you're giving too much weight to small possibilities. If every reason we have for believing something is wrong or does not justify belief, what we are left with is simply a mere chance probability that this thing exists. Now, if we were to give it a agnostic, a 50-50 chance, then we would have to give a 50-50 chance to everything which is possible by mere chance. In which case, we're engaging in a reductio ad absurdum, because you could create any concept or any idea and we would have to give that a 50-50% chance, because there's, of course, that small blind probability chance that it exists. Just, we would have no possible way of justifying that. So what I would say is the best method is to use my good old friend Occam's razor and say that it doesn't exist, that they don't exist. With complete lack of reason to say that it does exist, believing it seems kind of superfluous, doesn't it? Because if we want to be technically true, there's a small possibility, at least a chance probability, that anything exists if it's not logically proven that it cannot exist. But these things are nothing more likely than flying meatball monsters, or anything else that we can just conceive of up the top of our head. If it's within the realm of logical possibility, if there are no inherent logical contradictions, there is a small blind chance that anything could exist. But if we were to believe in everything that was given a blind chance, we're engaging in reductio ad absurdum. It's much simpler to just say you believe these people are wrong, even though technically there's that small possibility that they're right, even if it's for completely the wrong reasons. And that's how most atheists view God. They don't need to use positive arguments because they don't use positive arguments to arrive at that conclusion. It's just simply a use of Occam's razor from the neutral state to avoid the absurdity of believing in everything or giving 50% chance to everything that is within logical possibility. And of course there are atheists who try to remove this logical possibility for God. It's a reinforcer, if you will, of that belief, but it's not really necessary. Something doesn't have to be definitively disproven to justify believing that it does not exist. It simply requires that the chance is small enough that to believe otherwise would be absurd. All our ideas come from somewhere. If the idea of God came from somewhere false, and is justified with unconvincing and false arguments, surely it's a stronger possibility that God does not exist than exists. And that's why most atheists feel they only need to argue towards the neutral state. Because we're not atheists because of omnipotence paradoxes. We're atheists because we believe the reasons that you believe in God are wrong. We're atheists because we believe without those reasons, the chance of God existing is too small to warrant belief. Our burden of proof is to demonstrate that the reasons you believe in God are either false or unjustified. And that is the only thing that we have to show.